Picture this. It's 1974, and you're 7 years old, racing down a British street on a bicycle with no helmet, the wind whipping through your hair, not a care in the world. Your mother waves you off from the doorstep, tells you to be back before dark, and that's it. No mobile phone in your pocket, no tracking device, no panic. Because this was normal. This was childhood in 1970s Britain, and we all believed, with a certainty that seems almost quaint now, that it was safer than today. We look back through rose-tinted glasses at a time when children played freely, when communities looked out for one another, when the streets felt like they belonged to us. But was it really safer? Or have we forgotten the hidden dangers that lurked in every corner of that seemingly innocent world? Today we're going to uncover 12 forgotten perils that were simply part and parcel of growing up in 70s Britain. Dangers so normalized that nobody even thought to warn us about them. Number 12. Playing in building sites and demolition zones. Every neighborhood in 70s Britain seemed to have one, that patch of wasteland where old terraces had been knocked down or new estates were going up, and it was the most magnetic place for any child within a mile radius. The rubble created mountains to conquer. The half-demolished walls became fortresses for imaginary battles, and those deep, rain-filled foundations transformed into murky swimming holes on hot summer days. You'd climb through gaps in the flimsy wire fencing, the kind that was more suggestion than barrier, and suddenly you were in an adventure playground that cost nothing and asked nothing except your imagination. The smell of damp concrete dust hung in the air, mixing with the rust from exposed metal rebar that jutted out at all angles like jagged teeth. You'd balance on crumbling brick walls, leap across gaps where floors had been, explore basements filled with stagnant water and broken glass that glinted in the shafts of light from above. Sometimes you'd find treasures, old bottles or coins, sometimes just the thrill of being somewhere you probably shouldn't be. Parents knew, of course they knew, but it was just what children did. You'd come home covered in brick dust and mud, and your mother would tut and tell you to leave your shoes by the door. Nobody spoke about the children who fell through rotten floorboards, who cut themselves on rusty metal and needed tetanus jabs, who were buried when unstable walls collapsed. These weren't statistics that made the evening news. They were just accidents, terrible bad luck, the sort of thing that happened sometimes. Try taking your child to a modern building site today and watch what happens. You won't get within 50 feet of the perimeter before security appears. There are proper fences now, tall and impenetrable, with warning signs every few yards threatening prosecution. Risk assessments and health and safety regulations have transformed these spaces from playgrounds into forbidden zones. And we've gained safety, undoubtedly, but we've lost something too, that feeling of exploration, of conquered danger, of territory that belonged to children rather than to adults and their rules. Number 11. Riding in cars with no seat belts and certainly no car seats. The family car in the 70s was a different beast entirely from today's vehicles. A Morris Marina, perhaps, or a Ford Cortina, with vinyl seats that burned your legs in summer and froze them solid in winter. And the back seat? That was a free-for-all, a space where children tumbled about like clothes in a washing machine. No one wore seat belts because, well, they were uncomfortable, and anyway, weren't they just for long motorway journeys? For the weekly trip to the shops or to visit Nan, you'd simply pile in, 3 or 4 children squashed together, fighting over who got the window seat, pressing your faces against the glass to make it steam up. On longer journeys, you might even stretch out on the parcel shelf beneath the rear window, that impossibly uncomfortable space that somehow felt like the best seat in the house because you could see the sky and feel like you were flying. Your parents would brake suddenly, and you'd shoot forward, sometimes ending up in the footwell, and everyone would laugh because you looked so silly down there, tangled up with someone's feet and the road atlas. The car would fill with cigarette smoke from your father's embassy, the windows cracked open just enough to let in the roar of wind, but not enough to clear the air. And in winter, The heater would blow out air that smelled of warm dust and engine oil, and you'd draw pictures in the condensation on the windows while your mother passed back barley sugars to keep you quiet. There was something wonderfully free about it, something that spoke to the casual attitude toward risk that defined the era. We simply didn't think about what would happen in a crash, even though crashes happened all the time. Today, the idea is not just frowned upon, but illegal. Children are strapped into car seats that resemble space shuttle equipment with 5-point harnesses and side impact protection. There are laws about weight limits and height requirements, about which seats face forward and which face back. Parents can be fined hundreds of pounds for not securing their children properly. And it's right, of course it is. The statistics on child deaths and injuries from car accidents have plummeted since the 70s. But when you're helping your own child into their elaborate car seat, clicking and adjusting and checking, sometimes you can't help but remember that feeling of freedom, of rolling around in the back of the car on a Sunday afternoon, of thinking the journey was as much part of the adventure as the destination. Number 10, playing with mercury from broken thermometers. It's difficult to explain the magnetic appeal of mercury to anyone who never experienced it, but to children of the 70s, it was pure magic, a substance that seemed to defy the very laws of nature. When a thermometer broke, which they did with surprising frequency given how fragile they were, those tiny silver balls would scatter across the floor or the table, and we'd spend ages trying to gather them up. They'd roll and divide, merge and separate again. All was moving, all was elusive. You could push them around with your finger, feeling them slide over your skin cold and oddly alive. Sometimes you'd succeed in corralling several droplets together, watching in fascination as they suddenly rushed together to form one larger sphere, as if greeting old friends. We'd keep it in a little glass jar or a tin, showing it to friends, watching it roll back and forth like a tiny liquid pet. The way it caught the light was mesmerizing, reflecting everything in its perfect silver surface. In school science lessons, teachers would sometimes even pass around a dish of mercury, letting children experience its strange weight and behavior firsthand. "Don't swallow it," they'd say, as if that was the only concern, and we'd laugh because who on earth would swallow it? Nobody told us that mercury vapor was poisoning us with every breath we took near it. Nobody mentioned that touching it allowed toxins to absorb through our skin, accumulating in our bodies, potentially damaging our kidneys and nervous systems. The word neurotoxin wasn't in our vocabulary. Mercury was just interesting, a curiosity, a bit of fun from a broken thermometer. Today, if a mercury thermometer breaks in a home, there are official procedures to follow. You're supposed to evacuate the room, ventilate it thoroughly, use special equipment to clean up every last droplet, dispose of it as hazardous waste. Mercury thermometers themselves have largely disappeared, replaced by digital ones that offer none of the drama, but infinitely more safety. And it's a perfect example of how the 70s approached risk with a shrug and a sense that if we survived our own childhoods, well, surely our children would survive theirs. Number 9, the choking hazards in every toy box. The toys of 70s. Britain were wonderful, inventive things, but they shared one common feature that would give a modern safety inspector heart palpitations. They were made of small, detachable parts that came off with alarming ease. A cuddly toy wasn't complete without hard plastic eyes and nose that could be prized off with determined fingers, and once removed, were exactly the right size to lodge in a small windpipe. Action figures came with tiny weapons and accessories that would scatter across the floor, waiting to be stepped on by a bare foot, or, more dangerously, discovered by a curious toddler who explored the world through their mouth. Marbles were everywhere, beautiful glass spheres that caught the light and rolled into impossible-to-reach corners, each one a potential choking hazard just waiting for its moment. And then there were the board games with their miniature plastic pieces, hotels and houses, and little colored pegs, all small enough to disappear down a throat. The packaging rarely mentioned age recommendations, and certainly nothing as specific as not suitable for children under 3 due to small parts. Older siblings shared their toys freely with younger ones because toys were expensive and meant to be shared. You'd find a 3-year-old happily sucking on their brother's Subbuteo player, the tiny footballer gradually dissolving its paint in a small mouth, while parents nodded approvingly at how nicely the children were playing together. Lead paint was still common on older toys, adding another invisible layer of danger to the mix. The finish might be chipped and flaking, but that just added character. And anyway, toys were meant to last, to be passed down from child to child, accumulating layers of play and history. When a child choked, it was treated as a terrible accident, a moment of parental inattention, never as a design flaw in the toy itself. Today, toy safety regulations are extraordinarily strict. There are mandatory testing procedures, suffocation warnings on every plastic bag, clear age guidelines on every package. Small parts are banned for young children, and the few toys that contain them come with warnings so stark they read like legal documents. Manufacturers face enormous liability if a child is harmed by their product, and we're undoubtedly safer for it, but sometimes looking at a modern toy box with its oversized, permanently attached features and its soft, rounded edges, you can't help but feel we've sanitized childhood down to something that's lost a bit of its texture, its complexity, its acceptance that the world contains both wonder and risk in equal measure. Number 8, playing near and in open water without supervision. Britain in the 70s was laced with water, not just the obvious seaside and rivers, but farm ponds, canals, reservoirs, gravel pits flooded with rain, and those mysterious dark pools that appeared in quarries and industrial sites. And children were drawn to water like iron filings to a magnet. On hot summer days, when the sun beat down and the air shimmered over the tarmac, you'd hear about a place where you could swim, some unofficial spot that all the local children knew. Nobody's parents had given permission, exactly, but then nobody had expressly forbidden it either, because that would have required acknowledging that you were going there in the first place. You'd set off with a towel rolled under your arm, walking the railway paths or cutting through fields until you reached it, this perfect secret spot. Maybe it was a section of canal where the water looked deceptively clear, or a flooded quarry with cliffs you could jump from if you were brave enough, or feeling the drop in your stomach as you fell through the air. There were no lifeguards, no depth markers, no safety briefings. You learned to swim by being thrown in or by watching older children and copying them. The water was often freezing even in summer, and certainly filthy, filled with shopping trolleys and bicycle frames and all manner of rusted things that lurked beneath the surface. Sometimes there were currents you didn't expect, or sudden drop-offs where you'd be standing in 3 feet of water one moment and completely out of your depth the next. Weeds wrapped around your ankles like cold fingers, and you'd thrash your way free, laughing to hide the spike of fear. And boys would dare each other to swim further, to dive deeper, to prove their courage in ways that were absolutely foolhardy. Parents might have had a vague idea that you'd gone to play by the water, but the reality of what that meant, the risks involved, remained comfortably unexamined. When children drowned, and they did, with heartbreaking regularity, communities would mourn, perhaps erect a warning sign, and then life would continue much as before. Try letting your child disappear for an afternoon to swim in an unmonitored quarry now. You'd likely have social services knocking on your door. Modern Britain has fenced off most of these wild swimming spots, posted warning signs in multiple languages, and created designated swimming areas with trained lifeguards and safety equipment. Swimming lessons are considered essential, and children are watched constantly around any body of water. The casualty rates have plummeted, and that's undeniably good. But something has been lost too, that sense of discovery, of finding your own place, of testing yourself against nature without adults, hovering nearby, ready to intervene at the first sign of difficulty. Number 7, the casual presence of asbestos in schools and homes. There's a word that strikes fear into modern hearts: asbestos. We know now what we didn't know then, that those innocent-looking fibers were deadly, that they'd linger in lungs for decades before making their presence felt in the form of mesothelioma and other horrific cancers. But in 70s, Britain asbestos was everywhere, and nobody gave it a second thought. It was the miracle material, the one that insulated, that prevented fires, that was cheap and effective, and seemed to solve so many problems. School ceilings were often made of asbestos tiles, those slightly textured squares that you'd stare at during boring lessons, sometimes flaking a bit at the edges, sending tiny fibers drifting down into the classroom air. The boiler rooms had asbestos lagging wrapped around all the pipes, that gray-white material that would crumble if you touched it, and of course children, being children, you'd sometimes pull bits off just because you could, crushing it in your hands to see how it disintegrated. In homes, particularly in council estates and newer builds, asbestos was used for roofing, for garage panels, for bathroom and kitchen surfaces. That Artex ceiling in the living room, with its swirled patterns that were so fashionable, often contained asbestos. Those concrete panels in the garage, probably full of it. And when buildings were demolished or renovated, which happened constantly as Britain rebuilt itself throughout the decade, there were no hazmat suits, no sealed containment areas, no special disposal procedures. Workers would simply smash through walls and tear out panels, sending clouds of asbestos dust into the air while local children played nearby, breathing it all in. The school you attended might have been undergoing repairs, and you'd walk past the work in progress, maybe even peek in to watch the builders inhaling fibers that wouldn't show their effects for 30 or 40 years. Today, asbestos removal is a serious, carefully regulated business requiring specialist companies, protective equipment, and enormous expense. Buildings are surveyed before any renovation work, and if asbestos is found, entire procedures must be followed to ensure it's safely removed. Warning signs go up, areas are sealed off, and even then there's anxiety about whether it's being handled properly. Schools and hospitals have had to close for years while asbestos is painstakingly removed. And all the while, people who were children in the 70s wait, wondering whether their bodies are carrying a time bomb planted decades ago, when nobody knew any better, and asbestos seemed like just another building material as innocent as brick or concrete. Number 6, the lack of stranger danger awareness and the freedom to roam. Perhaps nothing defines the contrast between 70s childhood and modern childhood quite like the attitude toward strangers and freedom of movement. In the 70s, children had a level of independence that would be considered neglectful today. At 7 or 8 years old, you'd be sent to the shops on your own, walking down streets you knew, making your way to the newsagent or the grocer with a list from your mother and a pound note clutched in your hand. You might stop to talk to neighbors, to pet someone's dog, to watch workers repairing the road. You'd walk to school on your own or with friends unsupervised, crossing roads, taking shortcuts through alleyways, making your own way through the world. On weekends and school holidays, you'd leave the house in the morning and not return until tea time, and your parents had only the vaguest idea of where you'd been. Outplaying was sufficient explanation. You roamed across parks and wasteland, climbed trees and woods, explored abandoned buildings, all without adult oversight. And the concept of stranger danger barely existed. Adults were generally to be trusted, and if a stranger offered you a sweet or asked you to help find their lost dog, well, it seemed rude to refuse. Community was strong, and there was a sense that adults looked out for all children, not just their own. If you misbehaved, the neighbor might tell you off, and you'd accept it because adults had authority. But this same trust, this same freedom, had a dark side that wasn't acknowledged. Child abduction and abuse existed, of course, though it was rarely discussed openly, and when it happened, it was treated as an aberration so rare as to be almost unimaginable. Communities would be shocked, horrified, but there wouldn't be a wholesale rethinking of how children moved through the world. The idea that predators might be part of your community, might be trusted adults, was too disturbing to contemplate. And so children remained vulnerable, innocent, unwarned about dangers that very much existed. Today, stranger danger is drilled into children from the youngest age. Parents track their children's locations on phones, arrange playdates rather than letting children knock on doors, drive them to school rather than letting them walk. The same journey to the shops that an 8-year-old made alone in 1975 would now be unthinkable before the age of 12 or 13, and even then, only with a mobile phone and strict instructions to report in. And crime statistics actually show that children are safer now than they were then, though media coverage of the crimes that do occur makes it feel otherwise. We've gained safety, but we've lost freedom, and it's hard to say which generation has been better served. The 70s child who roamed freely learned independence and self-reliance, but they also faced risks that modern children are shielded from. And there's no easy answer to which approach is better, just a recognition that childhood itself has been fundamentally redefined in the space of 2 generations. Number 5, fireworks season as a domestic free-for-all. November in 70s. Britain meant one thing, fireworks, and not the carefully controlled, professionally managed displays of today, but a glorious, terrifying free-for-all that lasted weeks rather than one night. From late October onwards, corner shops and newsagents would stock fireworks displayed in colorful boxes behind the counter, available to anyone with a few shillings to spend, and the law was remarkably relaxed. Children could buy fireworks, and many did, pooling their pocket money for a stash of bangers and rockets and Catherine wheels. There was a legal age, technically 16, but enforcement was patchy at best, and shopkeepers were often remarkably unconcerned about checking. You'd walk home with your paper bag of explosives, rattling with potential energy, and the excitement was almost unbearable. Bonfire night itself was a neighborhood affair. Families would have their own bonfires in back gardens, often built from anything flammable, old furniture, wooden pallets, cardboard boxes, piled high and set alight with barely a thought for how close it was to fences or sheds. And then the fireworks would start. Fathers would hold rockets, those long wooden sticks with the explosive charge at the top, carefully angling them toward the sky before lighting the fuse with a cigarette or match and standing well back, hopefully. Except sometimes the rocket would tip over just as it fired, shooting horizontally across the garden, and everyone would scatter, laughing and screaming. Children would hold sparklers, those wire wands that burned white-hot, dripping molten metal that could easily burn through skin if it landed on you. The air would fill with smoke, thick and acrid, smelling of gunpowder and burning wood. And you'd watch the explosions light up the sky, feeling the delayed thump of the concussion in your chest. Bangers were particularly popular with boys, loud little firecrackers that you'd throw into the street or, if you were particularly stupid and lucky, hold for a second before throwing, trying to time it so it exploded mid-air. Casualties were common, burns and eye injuries and worse, but it was considered part of the territory, the price of excitement. Today, firework regulations are strict and strongly enforced. Private sales are limited to a few weeks around Bonfire Night and New Year's. Many types of powerful fireworks are banned entirely for private use. Noise limits are imposed, and increasingly, communities are moving toward organized professional displays rather than private celebrations, citing safety concerns, environmental impact, and consideration for pets and people with PTSD. The nights are quieter now, more controlled, undeniably safer. But they've lost that edge of chaos, that sense that anything might happen that made fireworks season in the 70s such a memorable, if occasionally terrifying, time. Number 4. the normalization of smoking everywhere, including around children. To understand 70s Britain, you need to understand that it existed in a permanent haze of cigarette smoke. Everyone smoked, or so it seemed. Your parents smoked, your teachers smoked, doctors smoked in their surgeries while giving you a checkup, midwives smoked during labor deliveries. Smoking was sophisticated, adult, and utterly ubiquitous. In the home, your father might get through 40 cigarettes a day, lighting one from the stub of another, filling the living room with layers of blue-gray smoke that hung in the air like weather. Your mother might smoke while cooking, the cigarette balanced on the edge of the kitchen counter, ash growing long before tumbling into whatever she was preparing. Nobody saw any problem with this, certainly not where children were concerned. Car journeys were thick with smoke, windows open just a crack because fresh air was for summer. Restaurants had smoking sections, but the smoke didn't respect boundaries, drifting across the room to settle on everyone's food and clothes. Hospital waiting rooms had ashtrays on every surface. Television presenters smoked during broadcasts. The sweet shop where you bought your penny chews would have a cloud of smoke behind the counter, the shopkeeper's cigarette smoldering while they served you. And children were absolutely marinated in it, breathing in secondhand smoke from their first moments of life, their clothes reeking of it, their lungs developing in an environment that we now know was actively harmful. But beyond the passive smoking, there was something more insidious. Smoking was so normalized that children aspired to it. It was what grown-ups did, and therefore it seemed like maturity, sophistication, something to look forward to. Boys would steal cigarettes from their fathers' packets and smoke behind the bike sheds at school, choking on the harsh smoke but feeling incredibly adult. Chocolate cigarettes were sold to children, white candy sticks with red tips, allowing them to mimic their parents, and nobody saw anything wrong with this, with literally training children to associate smoking with pleasure and sophistication. Today, the transformation is complete and remarkable. Smoking is banned in almost every public space, including pubs, restaurants, workplaces, and even outdoor areas near buildings. The packaging is covered in graphic health warnings, hidden behind plain packs, sold at prices that would have seemed unimaginable in the 70s. Smoking rates have plummeted, especially among young people. And the secondhand smoke exposure that we all experienced as children is now recognized as a serious health issue, one that's particularly damaging for developing lungs and linked to everything from asthma to sudden infant death syndrome. The 70s were slowly killing us with smoke, and we had no idea, thought it was just the smell of adulthood, the price of being part of the modern world. Number 3, unregulated and dangerous playground equipment. The playgrounds of 70s Britain were marvelous, terrifying death traps that children adored absolutely. Built primarily from metal, often rusty, these structures were designed with no apparent regard for what we now call child safety. The equipment was hard, unyielding, positioned over surfaces that would be classified as hazardous today. The crowning glory of any playground was the roundabout, that circular platform that you'd spin as fast as physically possible. Children clinging to the metal bars as centrifugal force tried to fling them off into the air. The faster it went, the better, and you'd run alongside pushing it, then leap on at the last second, feeling the world blur around you, your stomach lurching, other children screaming with delight or terror or both. If you fell off, which happened regularly, you'd land on tarmac or concrete, skinning your hands and knees at best, breaking bones at worst. The impact would knock the wind out of you, and you'd lie there for a moment, stunned, before getting up and probably having another go, because pain was temporary, but glory was forever. Then there were the swings, simple and brutal. Metal seats suspended on chains. You'd swing higher and higher, until at the peak of the arc you felt weightless for a magical moment before gravity snatched you back down. And boys would compete to see who could swing high enough to make the entire frame lift slightly from its concrete moorings, that moment when the chains went slack and you experienced a brief terrifying freefall, before the swing caught you again, or you'd jump off mid-swing, launching yourself into the air, landing however you landed, usually rolling to absorb the impact. The slides were tall, often metal, and in summer the metal would heat up to temperatures that would genuinely burn your skin through your clothes. You'd watch someone go ahead of you, hear them yelp as their legs touched the burning surface, and then you'd go anyway because what else were you going to do? In winter, ice would make them treacherously fast, and you'd shoot down at speeds that terrified and thrilled in equal measure. And the witches' hats, those conical rotating platforms that you could hang from or sit on top of while it spun around a central pole, were particularly good at building up speed before flinging children off in all directions. Climbing frames were built to impressive heights with no safety netting, just your own grip strength and sense of balance between you and a long fall to hard ground. Parents would watch sometimes, but mostly they'd sit on benches nearby, chatting to other adults, not hovering, not interfering, trusting that children would learn their own limits, and we did learn, through bruises and scrapes and the occasional more serious injury. Today, modern playgrounds are almost unrecognizable. The surfaces are soft, impact-absorbing rubber or wood chips. Equipment is made of plastic and designed to prevent falls from height. Maximum speeds are engineered in. Rough edges are eliminated. Everything is tested to within an inch of its life, meeting standards that fill thick books of regulations, and they're safer, undeniably dramatically safer. But they're also less exciting, less challenging, less likely to give you that soaring feeling of having conquered something genuinely dangerous. And you can't help but wonder whether we've made childhood safer by making it smaller, by removing the risk along with the reward. Number 2, the prevalence of lead paint and lead exposure. Lead was everywhere in 70s Britain, invisibly poisoning a generation of children in ways we're only now beginning to fully understand. The most obvious source was paint. Homes built before the 1960s, which was most of them, were likely to have layers of lead-based paint on their walls, windows, and woodwork. And paint chips, peels, and turns to dust over time. Children would pick at it, pulling strips away from windowsills, playing with the flakes, sometimes even eating them, because the lead gave the paint a slightly sweet taste. Toddlers who explored the world through their mouths were particularly vulnerable, chewing on windowsills and furniture, ingesting lead with every gnaw. The dust from deteriorating lead paint would settle on surfaces throughout the home, invisible contamination that you'd inhale or ingest every time you touched something and then ate without washing your hands. But paint wasn't the only source. Petrol contained lead, added to improve engine performance, and every car on the road was spewing lead particles into the air with every journey. In busy streets and near main roads, the lead concentration in the air was dangerously high, and children playing outside were breathing it in with every breath. The soil in urban areas became contaminated with lead from decades of exhaust fumes, and children would play in it, dig in it, get it on their hands and under their fingernails. Water pipes were often made of lead, particularly in older properties, and every glass of water, every cup of tea, every meal cooked with water from the tap could contain dissolved lead, especially in areas with soft water that corroded the pipes more aggressively. And the terrible thing about lead is that it doesn't just pass through your system. It accumulates, particularly in the bones and brain, and it's particularly harmful to developing children. Lead exposure affects cognitive development, reduces IQ, impacts behavior and impulse control, and causes a range of physical health problems. But in the 70s, this wasn't widely understood or acknowledged. Lead poisoning was something that happened to industrial workers, not to ordinary children growing up in ordinary homes. When children struggled at school or displayed behavioral problems, lead exposure was never considered as a possible cause. Today, the transformation is striking. Lead paint in homes is treated as a serious hazard requiring professional remediation Petrol is unleaded and has been for decades. Lead pipes are being systematically replaced, and water companies monitor lead levels carefully. We've reduced environmental lead exposure dramatically, though the legacy remains in old buildings and contaminated soil. And researchers are now looking back at the 70s and 80s and drawing connections between the high lead exposure and various social problems that manifested in those generations. It's impossible to know how much brighter, healthier, or different we might have been without that invisible burden. How much potential was stolen by a heavy metal we couldn't see, taste, or avoid. Number 1, the attitude toward electrical safety and DIY repairs. In the 70s, Britain, there was an extraordinary faith in the average person's ability to handle electricity, coupled with a shocking, sometimes literally, disregard for proper safety procedures. DIY was the order of the day, not because people enjoyed it particularly, but because hiring professionals was expensive and unnecessary when you could just have a go yourself. And having a go yourself often extended to electrical work that would make a modern electrician weep with horror. Homes were filled with potential electrical hazards that were considered perfectly normal. Extension leads were daisy-chained together in long, overloaded chains. Multiple adapters were plugged into single sockets, creating a tangle of plugs and cables that grew warm to the touch. Frayed wires were repaired with electrical tape, not replaced. Light fittings were installed by whoever was handy with a screwdriver, regardless of whether they understood concepts like earthing or proper connections. And water and electricity mixed with alarming regularity. Bathroom heaters were often mounted on walls within arm's reach of the bath, controlled by pull cords that dangled temptingly. Kettles and toasters lived on kitchen counters right next to the sink, their cables trailing across wet surfaces. Electric fires, those glowing bars of heat, would be moved from room to room, dragged by their cables, positioned inches from curtains and furniture, left on unattended to heat rooms that had no other source of warmth. Children would be sent to turn on such fires, kneeling close to plug them in with wet hands after coming in from the rain, and nobody thought twice about it. When things went wrong, when sparks flew or fuses blew or someone got a shock, it was treated as just one of those things, an occupational hazard of modern living, rather than a sign that something was seriously dangerous. We learned not to stick things in plug sockets because we or our siblings had tried it once and received a shock that sent us flying across the room, not because adults had explained the dangers or put in safety covers. The number of house fires caused by electrical faults was horrific, and many fatalities were linked to faulty wiring or dangerous appliances. But there wasn't the culture of electrical safety that we have now. The understanding that electricity needs to be treated with respect and expertise. Today, electrical work is highly regulated and largely restricted to qualified electricians. Modern homes have circuit breakers and RCD protection that cuts power instantly if a fault is detected. Appliances must meet strict safety standards. Sockets in bathrooms must be specially designed and positioned. Extension leads have surge protection and overload cutoff. The plugs themselves are redesigned with shuttered sockets that children can't poke things into. And the death rate from electrocution has plummeted. But in the 70s, we were living with electrical systems and practices that were actively dangerous, treated with a casual familiarity that would have been perfectly at home in the Victorian era, and somehow most of us survived to tell the tale. Looking back across these 12 hidden dangers, what strikes you most forcefully is not just the specific hazards, but the entire mindset that allowed them to flourish. 70s, Britain operated on a fundamentally different calculation of risk, one that valued freedom and independence and self-reliance over safety and protection. Parents believed that children needed to encounter danger, to test themselves, to learn through experience rather than through warning. There was a stoicism to it, a sense that life itself was risky, and that wrapping children in cotton wool was doing them no favors. And in many ways, they were right. The children who grew up in that era learned resilience, learned to assess risk themselves, learned to pick themselves up when they fell. They had freedoms and adventures that modern children, tracked and supervised and guided, might never experience. But the cost was real and it was high. Children died from preventable accidents at rates that would be considered scandalous today. Others suffered injuries that affected them for life, or were exposed to toxins that would compromise their health decades later. The question isn't whether 70s childhood was better or worse than modern childhood. It was simply different, operating under a different set of assumptions about what children needed and what risks were acceptable. And we've swung hard in the opposite direction, perhaps too hard, insulating children from risk to a degree that might be doing its own kind of harm, preventing them from developing independence and resilience. The truth probably lies somewhere in the middle, in finding a way to give children freedom and challenge while protecting them from the most serious dangers, in acknowledging that risk is part of life while minimizing the risks that are truly unnecessary. We can look back at the 70s with nostalgia for the freedoms and the simplicity while acknowledging the very real dangers that lurked beneath the surface. It was a different time, when we didn't know what we didn't know, when asbestos and lead and secondhand smoke seemed harmless, when letting children roam unsupervised felt safe. And perhaps the measure of progress isn't just that we've made childhood safer, though we have, but that we've learned to look more carefully at the hidden dangers, to question assumptions, to protect the vulnerable, even when it means sacrificing convenience or freedom. The 70s are gone, and with them, a particular kind of childhood that will never return, for better and for worse. And those of us who lived through it carry those memories, those scars and strengths in equal measure, a testament to an age when childhood was wilder, freer, and more dangerous than young people today could possibly imagine.